Her ex mocked her for being alone. Seconds later, her secret mafia husband walked through the door. Ryan Calloway thought Emma Miller was still the broken woman he left behind. He smiled, pitied her, and asked if she had finally found a husband. But before he could enjoy her humiliation, the entire gallery went quiet. James Hawke entered in a charcoal suit, 2 dangerous men behind him, and one touch on Emma's back told everyone the truth. She wasn't T alone. She was married to the most feared man in the city. We begin our clinical observation with a classic provocation. Listen to the auditory signature of a lesser narcissist. Ryan Calloway projected his voice across the gallery, a calculated cruelty disguised as pity. The subject, Emma Miller, exhibited zero startle response. No autonomic spike. Instead, she offered him a smile. You and I must understand the pathology here. She allowed him his delusion of dominance, fully aware she had already developed Stockholm Syndrome for the apex predator of their city. She had secretly married James Hawke, a man whose profile defines the megalomaniacal narcissist. Subscribe and follow this case file to its conclusion. Name your city in the comments, and let us track the spread of this behavioral contagion. The night Ryan decided to attempt a public humiliation of his former victim was the exact moment he sealed his own destruction. Emma had arrived at the Whitmore Gallery alone, a behavioral adaptation she had cultivated deliberately. She wore a dark red dress, not to invite observation, but to practice existing states before invisibility was no longer an option. She stood near the perimeter, managing her baseline anxiety with a glass of champagne. She was performing the exhausting psychological labor of simulating normalcy among observers who possessed outdated data on her identity. Her coping mechanisms were functioning within normal parameters, right up until the auditory trigger of her former abuser shattered the equilibrium. Just 2 words: Emma Miller. Her sympathetic nervous system reacted instantly. Her spine locked into a defensive posture. She executed a controlled pivot. Ryan stood 12 feet away, displaying a predatory smile. It was a facial expression she once misidentified as affection, but now clinically recognized as pure manipulation, aimed precisely at her psychological vulnerabilities. Her voice remained entirely flat when she spoke his name. A defense mechanism. He closed the physical distance with the unearned confidence of a man entirely lacking in self-awareness. He visually scanned her, not with human desire, but with the cold, assessing gaze of an owner evaluating a discarded asset for its current emotional market value. You look different, he remarked, followed by a laugh designed to destabilize her. He stopped precisely at arm's length, an invading proximity meant to assert control while maintaining deniability. He interrogated her about leaving her clinical practice and moving out of her apartment. He actually used the slow, repetitive, nodding common to those incapable of active listening. When he questioned her current employment status, she offered a non-committal evasion, explaining the true architectural structure of her new reality to a man like Ryan would be the equivalent of handing a loaded firearm to a toddler. He simply tilted his head, completely blind to the fact that he was observing a woman who had radically mutated to survive. Let us observe the cognitive distortion happening right now. Emma watched him perform a rapid mental calculation, an abusive metric she had spent years learning to identify and disarm. He was measuring her current state against his own fabricated narrative of her inevitable decline. He noted she came alone, delivering the observation with surgical malice, wrapped in casual phrasing. He offered a slight shrug, which is perhaps the most insidious microaggression of all. It is the physical manifestation of covert pity, a tool used to inflict emotional trauma without leaving a visible bruise. He weaponized the passage of 2 years, suggesting her solitary state was a permanent defect rather than a symptom of profound psychological restructuring. He deployed a calculated pause before suggesting she should have found someone by now. The temperature of the glass in Emma's hand seemed to drop as her peripheral awareness collapsed. The gallery ambient noise faded. Her sensory processing narrowed exclusively to the 6 inches of airspace separating her from the man who once claimed monogamous devotion just weeks before betraying her. Ryan lowered his vocal register, simulating intimacy to inflict maximum damage. He claimed he worried about her psychological walls. Emma met his gaze with absolute motor stillness. You and I know that stillness in a trauma survivor is not paralysis. It is the intense vigilance of a prey animal that has evolved to mimic the stone it hides upon. Complete emotional suppression is a devastating countermeasure when one has already survived total psychological collapse. "How is your new partner?" she inquired, deploying the name with clinical precision. Ryan's manufactured smile experienced a rapid system failure. He offered a defensive, one-word confirmation of her well-being. Emma detected the minor contraction in his jaw when she asked much about the child, a standard stress indicator. Having gathered the necessary data, she initiated a clean withdrawal. She took 3 steps away, executing a successful disengagement protocol. But Ryan's vocalization arrested her momentum. He called her name with a softer inflection, acoustic manipulation she despised herself for responding to. He had breached her physical boundary once more, close enough that her olfactory receptors registered the specific sandalwood scent she had once purchased for him. An olfactory trigger. He attempted to rewrite their historical data in fiducials, claiming she deserved better treatment during their dissolution. He projected a false empathy, hoping she would secure a suitable partner. Emma turned to process his visual data without the distortion of her past affection. She diagnosed him instantly. She saw a man entirely governed by an unexamined narcissism, operating under the delusion that she was a depreciating asset waiting for his validation. It is a profound breakthrough when the victim finally sees the abuser as a common, predictable organism. She delivered the data point with a soft, neutralized tone. "I am married." The absolute silence that followed was a reward center stimulus for Emma. Ryan's facial musculature cycled rapidly through shock, cognitive dissonance, and finally, genuine psychological distress. She filed that momentary agony away in a cold sector of her memory. He demanded a timeline. 7 months ago, she confirmed, he struggled to process his exclusion from this information network. "Is he present at this venue?" he interrogated, his cognitive processing visibly degrading. Before Emma could supply the confirmation, the environmental variables of the room shifted entirely. It was not a violent disruption, but a fundamental alteration in atmospheric pressure. The apex predator does not require an auditory warning. When James Hawke entered the room, the collective nervous system of the gallery registered his presence. The ambient volume dropped by a measurable decibel level. It is a biological imperative to quiet down when a threat enters the territory. Right? Emma felt the shift before her visual cortex confirmed it. James stood at the threshold in a dark suit, his gaze possessing the cold, flat properties of winter water. He is the true megalomaniacal narcissist, a subject who does not merely occupy a room, but legally and psychologically annexes it. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried biomechanics of a man who perceives every living organism in the space as either an asset or an obstacle. 2 operatives flanking him were human architecture, designed to intimidate and isolate. They scanned the perimeter for ballistic trajectories, operating on a completely different survival matrix than the civilians present. James isolated Emma's coordinates in exactly 4 seconds. His ocular focus snapped from her face to the lesser threat standing 6 feet away and back to her, a single sweep full of data. In their 7 months of clinical Stockholm Syndrome, Emma had learned that his briefest fixation communicated volumes of tactical information. A subtle vibration against her palm confirmed his digital surveillance. She did not need to check the screen. The encrypted directive was already mapped in her brain. "I am outside. Do not react to my presence." It was a command rooted in absolute dominance. She maintained total motor inhibition as he navigated the crowd. His locomotion was inevitable, mimicking the physics of a rising tide. Upon reaching her coordinates, he applied microscopic pressure to the lumbar region of her spine. From a standard human, it would be a casual gesture. From James Hawke, it was a territorial branding. "You are carrying tension," he murmured, calibrating his volume exclusively for her auditory processing. When she noted she was merely following his directive, he corrected her. It was not a compliment on her compliance, but a clinical observation of her stress markers. His fingers increased their pressure by a fraction of an ounce. He demanded an immediate status report, interrogating the environment for threats. Before her vocal cords could engage, Ryan's voice intercepted the exchange. "You and I must marvel at the sheer evolutionary failure of Ryan Calloway. He possessed zero survival instincts, allowing his bloated ego to override the primal alarms ringing in his brainstem. He observed the physical proximity of James Hawke and experienced an ego threat. Operating on outdated software, Ryan extended his hand for a greeting. He announced his own name with the artificial confidence of a man, entirely unaware that he was attempting to initiate a social contract with a human wood chipper. It is a vital life lesson, truly. Never mistake your ignorance for invulnerability. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file together. We start with the classic predator-prey dynamic. Ryan extends his hand, attempting a normal social greeting. Unaware he is standing before an apex narcissist, James Hawke does not react with anger. He simply studies the hand like a pathologist, examining a tissue sample. The silence stretches. It is the tactical quiet of a closed door, masking the absolute control behind it. Hawke finally speaks, his voice flat, stating he knows exactly who Ryan is. The hand drops, awkward and defeated. Here is a simple truth for you to remember. True power never has to raise its voice to make you feel completely helpless. Emma offers the civilian no emotional rescue. This is a textbook trauma response protecting the captor over the past connection. Ryan stammers, the realization crashing into his fragile ego as he identifies James as the husband. It is a heavy, immovable fact. I have watched this specific sequence on countless prison visitation tapes, the sudden recalculation on a man's face when he understands the woman he spent 2 years quietly pitying is now bound to a megalomaniac. James stands there, immaculate in his charcoal suit, radiating the kind of systemic threat that Ryan, a completely ordinary man, lacks the psychological hardware to process. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. Never assume you understand the cages other people choose to live in. Ryan's response crumbles, entirely stripped of its structural integrity. The verbal destruction is complete. James then delivers a clinical dismissal, thanking the man for his time with the polite indifference of a warden ending visiting hours. He turns to Emma, his gray eyes asking a question she cannot possibly answer. He states they have somewhere to be. It is not a request. It is a behavioral command disguised as etiquette. They move toward the side exit, her heels tapping a quiet, rhythmic retreat on the marble floor. James removes his hand from her back immediately, establishing exactly 6 inches of empty space between them. It is a calculated deprivation, a physical reminder of the boundary he alone controls. Let us look at this physical gap closely. 6 deliberate inches maintained over 7 months of domestic isolation. They act as if proximity is a lethal voltage, an unspoken agreement typical in high-control relationships. Once they reach the dim light of the corridor, shielded from the gallery's low murmur, Emma finally speaks. She confronts him about knowing Ryan's name before tonight. James does not look away. In my experience profiling these types, a true narcissist never breaks eye contact when delivering a fact, nor when omitting a crucial truth. Emma finds this trait utterly haunting, the total blur between honesty and manipulation. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that a predator's honesty can be just as damaging as their lies. His reply is evasive, a simple assertion of time without substance. Emma correctly notes this is not an actual answer, her tone shifting into a flat statement. Victims of extended psychological confinement quickly learn to stop asking questions when they already know the grim reality. She pieces it together, realizing he engineered his presence based on the guest list. A micro-expression flickers across his face, a tiny slip of control that vanishes instantly. She presses the issue of timing. Her voice drops into that hollow, clinical register. She describes Ryan looking at her with pity, treating her like discarded baggage. It is the painful admission of a captive athlete realizing how thoroughly her isolation has altered her reflection in the outside world. She recounts the public humiliation, the way Ryan questioned her relationship status in front of the city's legal elite. She firmly insists she had handled the situation before James intervened, but then she asks the dangerous question, looking directly into his carved, unreadable face. Why was he really there? You have to understand that James Hawke possesses the stoicism of a man who could order a hit while drinking his morning coffee. Yet, over 7 months, Emma has developed the acute hypervigilance of Stockholm Syndrome. She has learned to translate the spaces inside his silences, reading his breathing the way hostages read their captors to survive. In this specific hallway, she uncovers a motive she is entirely unprepared to process. Stick with me now, because this is where the psychological pivot occurs. He simply states he wants to be there. No strategic framing, no manipulative preamble, just a raw, terrifying admission handed over like a loaded weapon. The simplicity of it strikes her nervous system. Emma stands in that quiet corridor and mentally reviews the cold, legal contract she signed 7 months prior, an arrangement built to be purely transactional and emotionally sterile. Now, that careful architecture is cracking. She suggests they leave, her voice maintaining an outward composure that her racing pulse completely betrays. He agrees with the same chilling calm. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a manipulator can do is give you a glimpse of genuine desire. As they walk, that faithful shadow of 6 inches remains between them, an invisible electric fence. Emma stares dead ahead at the exit doors. A slow, heavy certainty settles deep within her chest, the clinical realization that she is profoundly trapped. Not by the pathetic condescension of Ryan Calloway. She has the social armor for that. The real threat is the man in the charcoal suit who weaponizes his own restraint, who drops a quiet confession of desire as if discussing the weather. Meanwhile, back in the gallery, her former fiancé stands frozen with his drink. As Ryan is slowly choking on the realization, that entire mental model of Emma Miller has been demolished, leaving him completely disoriented in the wake of a predator. Ryan remains blissfully ignorant of the irreality. He does not know what James Hawke does, the criminal infrastructure he commands, or why an entire room of wealthy adults instinctively submitted to his presence. As the cold night air hits Emma's face, and she approaches the waiting black car, understands a harsh truth. Ignorance is the only shield Ryan has left, and she hopes he is smart enough to stay completely blind. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere turns dense. This is not the relaxed quiet of a settled couple. This is the suffocating, high-pressure vacuum of 2 people who have spent 7 months meticulously avoiding the massive psychological elephant in the room. Unspoken words can weigh heavier than any physical chains. I crossed the street, grabbed his shirt. They sit on opposite sides of the leather seat, the physical distance mimicking their emotional barricades. The city's lights bleed across the glass, flashing across their faces in rhythmic, interrogation-style bursts. Neither speaks. The driver, Marcus, breaks the tension. In my files, men like Marcus are the ultimate enablers, loyal veterans who know exactly when a single observation can detonate a fragile dynamic. He mentions the Calloway situation without looking back. James instantly silences him. But the phrase has already lodged itself in Emma's chest, burning like a localized infection. She repeats the clinical terminology, her voice terrifyingly flat. James turns his head just a fraction. He coldly confirms that Ryan is in fact a situation. You and I have probably both witnessed how pathological control masquerades as protection. Emma confronts him directly, turning fully in her seat. She knows the only way to interrogate a mastermind is to block every single exit route for his charming deflections. She corners him. He knew about the ex before he sent the text, before he even entered the building. Her mind clicks into a terrifyingly logical gear. She asks the $1 million question. Has he been having her followed? The resulting 3-second pause is absolutely deafening. In the behavioral sciences, a 3-second hesitation from a man like Hawk is a signed, notarized confession. He slowly admits to having personnel who monitor certain environments, a brilliantly sterile euphemism. She lets that chilling phrase hang in the suffocating air of the car. An art gallery, she clarifies, where her ex-fiancé just happened to be attending, invited by one of James Seth's own mutual contacts. The orchestration is undeniably pathological. James pauses, noting that this was highly relevant information. She snaps back, demanding to know who exactly finds it relevant. He looks at her with those bottomless gray eyes and simply says it is relevant to him. Emma digs her fingers into her own knee, practicing grounding techniques to keep her nervous system from shattering. She refuses to have this psychological showdown in the back of a moving vehicle, with Marcus sitting just a few feet away, playing the role of an invisible witness. She demands they relocate the discussion to the house. She insists on a genuine explanation, refusing to accept another piece of sterilized corporate jargon. A flicker of something unresolved crosses his face, and it exhausts her, this constant inability to decipher the man she lives with. They arrive at the massive brownstone on the north end of the city. When she first arrived 7 months ago, with her luggage and that signed contract, she possessed the rigid composure of someone making a deeply practical, deeply flawed life choice. It took weeks for the feeling of being an intruder to fade, and it still haunts the edges of her mind. The moment they step inside, she drops her bag, pivoting to face him before the heavy door even clicks shut. "Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we?" She demands to know exactly how long she has been under surveillance. James methodically removes his jacket, folding it with the deliberate precision of a predator organizing its thoughts. He rejects the word watching. When pressed, he offers the term aware, claiming he is merely managing situations that might threaten her safety. It is the classic rationalization of a megalomaniac framing absolute dominance as benevolent care. Then, the tone of his voice fundamentally shifts. The clinical detachment drops, revealing something infinitely darker underneath. He reveals that 3 weeks ago, a man trailed her from a coffee shop on 9th Avenue to their front door. The illusion of safety shatters in an instant. Today, you and I are going to unpack the psychological architecture of a very specific captivity. It begins with a simple admission. James casually noted the stalker had been there yesterday, but his associate dealt with it. Emma froze, a classic autonomic nervous response to a sudden threat. When she pressed for his identity, James exhibited the micro-expressions of a megalomaniac calculating his narrative, claiming it was a separate business matter. Emma's voice fractured. Not from sadness, but from the profound psychological strain of cognitive dissonance. She was a woman who had meticulously suppressed her reality, and the containment walls were finally breaching. The lesson here is simple, really. You can only ignore the predator in the room until it finally locks the door. Emma attempted to assert control using the only framework she understood: legal boundaries. She reminded him of their contract, pressing her hand against the table to ground herself. During a rising panic response, she explicitly stated she had not agreed to be managed. James stepped toward her, then exhibited that half-second of behavioral restraint, typical of apex predators, masking their aggression. He acknowledged her paper contract, but immediately dismantled her reality. He coldly informed her that the moment she signed it, her world became inextricably bound to his pathology. He exhaled a perfectly measured release of tension and admitted he should have disclosed the stalker sooner. It is a textbook manipulation tactic, offering a minor concession to maintain total authority. He told her she deserved to know about the security measures. The admission hit her central nervous system like ice water. She quietly agreed, then asked the critical question, was there anything else being managed without her knowledge? James held her gaze, employing a devastating psychological mechanism. He looked away, just for a fraction of a second. A narcissist of his caliber never breaks eye contact when delivering the truth. He claimed there was nothing, before carefully adding that he had insulated her from his business to protect her. He was reframing his profound violation of her autonomy as an act of benevolence. The lesson we must internalize is that control wrapped in the guise of safety is still a cage. He was grooming her to accept her own helplessness and dependency. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The environment was dead silent, save for the ticking of a clock, a classic auditory anchor during a traumatic shift in reality. Emma demanded to know what he had been hiding, acknowledging that the truth would alter their dynamic. When he looked at her, she finally saw the underlying pathology she had been subconsciously ignoring for months. To examine it meant accepting that her calculated survival strategy had mutated into a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. A deeply unnatural bond was forming in the limbic space between them. It was an attachment possessing a gravitational pull she lacked the clinical vocabulary to identify. She was beginning to crave the very architect of her psychological imprisonment. James agreed to tell her everything, but delayed the gratification, another classic control metric. Before she could protest, his phone emitted 2 pulses, an auditory trigger signaling an urgent escalation. Emma watched his physiology transform. It is fascinating to a kingpin compartmentalize. His facial muscles hardened, his emotional affect flatlined. The mask of the husband dissolved, and the ruthless operator took precedence. He stated he had to take the call. Emma told him to go. A response dripping with the contradiction of her syndrome. She meant it, yet she deeply resented meaning it, and felt exposed, that he could read this internal war on her face. As he retreated into his study, she caught fragments of his dialogue before the father severed their connection. She heard him ask about timing, followed by an unfamiliar name data points of a criminal enterprise she was never meant to process. Left alone, Emma pressed her hands against her orbital bones, seeking physical pressure to counteract her psychological spiral. 7 months of a transactional marriage designed to be emotionally sterile, and now she realized strangers had been tracking her. Her legal husband quietly orchestrating her existence behind closed doors. Retreating to the kitchen, she brewed tea, attempting to ground herself with routine. She began to clinically map the chain of traumatic variables that had dragged her here. A reminder for us, all the mind will always seek logical patterns when surrounded by absolute chaos. You and I must look at the catalyst of her trauma. It originated with her older brother, Daniel. He possessed the sociopathic ability to present catastrophic ruin as a mere logistical hiccup. It was the exact attachment he used at 14 to announce their father's gambling destruction. 18 months ago, he deployed it to confess a massive financial debt. Daniel had not borrowed from traditional institutions. He had engaged with the underground economy. Now, violent collectors were demanding repayment, and they explicitly designated Emma as acceptable human collateral. The life lesson here is brutal but necessary. The most dangerous threats to our safety rarely come from strangers. They are often invited in by our own blood. When she repeated the word collateral into the receiver, she was experiencing an acute dissociative episode. Daniel clinically informed her that her survival required marrying a specific target. Sitting on her office floor in the middle of a Tuesday, Emma felt the fragile architecture of her rehabilitated life disintegrate into dust. The target was James Hawke, a name synonymous with apex predation in corporate and illicit circles alike. He controlled a towering downtown syndicate, masked his narcissism behind a hospital wing, bearing his name, and curated his existence in the business press to project an aura of untouchable legitimacy. To a behavioral analyst, this is the ultimate camouflage, hiding immense pathological control behind the pristine shield of public philanthropy. Stick with me, this is where the behavioral patterns get interesting. James Hawke existed in 2 realities: the sanitized public narrative and the whispered accounts of his true operational capacity. Emma demanded to know why a man possessing absolute power would require her. Her brother claimed it was a mere favor. She spent 3 days operating in a state of hyper-vigilant survival mode. She scoured public records, consulted trusted counsel, and drafted a behavioral containment protocol, a contract. She approached the negotiation with the cold precision of a veteran attorney, demanding financial isolation, separate living quarters, and stringent boundaries. It was her desperate attempt to assert control over a megalomaniac who had already purchased her reality. She required explicit documentation, ensuring her autonomy remained intact. 4 days before their mandated union, she sat across from him in a sterile conference room. James processed her exhaustive addendum without a single micro-expression of annoyance, a chilling display of emotional regulation. When he finally engaged, he isolated 2 specific variables. He casually dismissed the exit clause, demonstrating his absolute certainty that she would never leave. Instead, he zeroed in on her demand for willful ignorance. He rotated the document and targeted the exact boundary she had constructed to maintain her psychological safety. The clause explicitly forbade her from accessing any data regarding his operations. She thought she was building a fortress. He knew she was building her own isolation cell. He questioned her desire to remain blind. It was a clinical observation, delivered with a disturbing level of genuine curiosity. He was analyzing her defense mechanisms in real time. Emma firmly stated her desire for protection, rejecting any integration into his violent world. She insisted on maintaining the illusion of a normal existence, a wife on paper, detached from the reality funding her survival. James observed her for a prolonged interval before delivering a psychological truth she would dissect for months. He coldly informed her that remaining ignorant is not how protection functions. True safety, we must understand, never comes from closing our eyes to the threat. It requires staring directly into the teeth of the predator. She finally recognized his statement for what it was, a calculated warning. The heavy door swung open and James returned. His facial musculature was set in the exact configuration reserved for high-stakes violence. He registered her defensive posture and instantly calibrated his approach, announcing his departure. When Emma pressed him on the stalker and the potential for danger, James hesitated. That brief pause is where the narcissist measures exactly how much truth the subject can metabolize. He asked her to define dangerous, an evasive tactic designed to shift the cognitive load back onto her. Under the harsh light, she could finally see the physical toll of his pathology, the exhausting weight of maintaining absolute control over a fractured empire. The psychological cost of operating as an apex predator is rarely visible to the public, but it was etched entirely into his posture. He claimed the situation was manageable. Emma refused the deflection, demanding his return time. As she set her tea down, the final symptom of her Stockholm Syndrome manifested, she demanded full integration into his reality. She insisted on the unfiltered truth of what she had married into. James remained motionless, assessing this sudden escalation in her behavior. He warned her she would not like the reality she was asking for. When she told him to proceed anyway, his carefully constructed mask finally slipped. A new, raw expression surfaced. The most dangerous moment in any clinical case is when the captor realizes the captive is finally ready to embrace the dark. Let us open this clinical file together, you and I, and examine the architecture of a trauma bond. The subject, James, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, displayed a rare micro-expression of miscalculation before stating his agreement and departing. When the heavy door sealed shut, Emma remained motionless in the kitchen. Notice the absence of typical survival responses here. Early in her environment, she experienced profound terror, but adaptation is ruthless. Over 2 years, Emma systematically eradicated her own psychological vulnerabilities, a blunting common in Stockholm Syndrome. Fear requires a perception of fragility, and she had excised hers completely. Instead, her neural pathways fixated on a secondary threat from 3 weeks prior, and the enforcer named Marcus. Emma was trapped in severe cognitive dissonance, analyzing the violent reality as carefully insulated beneath her fabricated existence. Her mind looped obsessively over a specific gallery encounter, dissecting the paralyzed silence that followed James asserting his dominance as her husband. She also fixated on 5 isolated words delivered in a corridor, a breadcrumbing tactic used to maintain emotional dependency. Then, the somatic trigger occurred. Her telephone vibrated. It displayed an unknown origin. She had memorized the 3 numerical sequences belonging to James, a symptom of hypervigilance. The device demanded engagement. Her prefrontal cortex commanded her to ignore the stimulus. Yet the compulsion of the trauma bond forced her hand. She accepted the connection. The auditory stimulus belonged to an unidentified male, displaying the flattened affect of a seasoned predator. He inquired if his timing was poor. Emma experienced immediate physiological arousal, her grip constricting as she demanded his identity. He classified himself as a former associate of her husband. The caller utilized a sociopathic cadence, the relaxed tempo of an entity asserting absolute dominance. He suggested she lacked critical data regarding the megalomaniac narcissist she had married. When she questioned his intelligence gathering, he deflected with chilling arrogance, casually introducing her brother Daniel as a compliant asset. Emma meticulously placed her porcelain cup on the surface to mask her physiological tremors, issuing a firm boundary against future contact. The subject maintained an accommodating warmth, completely devoid of empathy. He urged her to weigh his data against the fabricated reality constructed by her husband. The connection terminated. Emma remained stationary, processing the acute neurological shock of realizing her defensive perimeter had been breached. You and I must recognize that control is the fundamental illusion of the captive, and hers had just shattered. She initiated 3 consecutive calls to her brother. Upon the final ring of the 3rd attempt, Daniel provided a highly regulated greeting. It was the distinct vocal signature of a man paralyzed by anticipatory dread, monitoring his device in terror. She immediately bypassed social protocol, demanding to know the identity of the entity that had breached her sanctuary. Emma informed him the caller possessed intimate knowledge of his compliance. She suppressed all vocal modulation, utilizing a flattened affect as a psychological shield against panic. She issued a singular demand for the caller's identity. She documented a jagged exhalation from Daniel. It was the biological response of a prey animal exhausting its final evasion tactic. He identified the antagonist as Victor Crane, the initial source of his financial subjugation. Emma shut her eyes, severing visual stimuli to process this data. Daniel frantically rationalized that the debt had migrated through various hostile entities. She immediately pivoted her interrogation to the core variable, demanding to know if James was aware of this development. A heavy, terrified silence echoed back. Her defensive barrier fractured momentarily, a micro-tremor in her vocal cords as she pressed for confirmation. Daniel confessed that James had orchestrated the acquisition 2 full years prior, entirely predating the marital arrangement. James had extracted the debt from Crane, triggering a territorial dispute between 2 pathological predators. Emma experienced acute dissociation. The ceramic flooring registered as freezing against her sol, alerting her to the absence of footwear she had no memory of removing. This physical detachment is a hallmark of traumatic processing. She began repeating, grabbed his shirt. She began the data points, systematically. Using logic of her former legal training to construct a coherent narrative out of the manipulation. She was dissecting the trap from within. She traced the timeline aloud. 6 months post-acquisition, the marriage was formalized, with the critical variable of prior ownership withheld. Now, the displaced predator was bypassing boundaries to destabilize her perception of her captor. She anchored her palm to the solid surface, grounding herself, and demanded to know Crane's true objective. Daniel confessed that Crane sought psychological leverage. His vocal resonance diminished into submissive terror. Emma felt a surge of clinical disgust at this weakness, recognizing his paralyzing fear of James was justified. Crane hypothesized that Emma was operating under a manufactured reality, He calculated that by shattering the Stockholm Syndrome and providing the unfiltered truth, he could weaponize her against the megalomaniac narcissist. She expelled a breath that mimicked amusement, but lacked all joy. She questioned if this rival recognized her training in adversarial law, noting that survival instincts remain permanently encoded. Realigning her posture, she reclaimed her cognitive authority. You and I often observe victims reconstructing their shattered autonomy through rigid rulemaking, and Emma was no exception. She issued absolute behavioral protocols to Daniel, forbidding all engagement with Crane. When Daniel attempted to warn her of the danger, she neutralized his panic with a chillingly stable tone, confirming her comprehension of the threat matrix. Securing his compliance, she terminated the connection. She remained mathematically still. For exactly 30 seconds, she permitted her emotional trauma to surface. During this biological window, she processed acute psychological vertigo and the profound mourning of a collapsed reality. She allowed the neurochemical flood to run its course without resistance. Once regulated, she initiated contact with her primary captor. The initial and secondary communication lines defaulted to automated recordings. She escalated to the tertiary sequence, designated strictly for critical breaches. The connection succeeded, but it was Marcus, the enforcer, who provided a sanitized greeting. He reported the megalomaniac narcissist as temporarily unavailable, projecting calculated neutrality. Emma refused to engage with his pacification tactics. Maintaining surgical precision in her vocal delivery, she commanded him to relay that Victor Crane had infiltrated her private communication network. She instructed him to confirm her awareness of the debt's origin. Establishing a strict deadline of 2 a.m, she executed a classic power inversion, threatening independent action to force the narcissist's hand. Marcus acknowledged the directive with immediate submission. Severing the line, Emma anchored herself at the table, mapping the behavioral profile of Victor Crane. He had cornered her sibling and identified her as the most effective psychological fulcrum against her husband. She reverse-engineered the timeline, dissecting the initial debt acquisition that predated the negotiated conditions of their union. Her memory retrieved a specific data point from their early confinement. It was during a mandated social exhibition, a dinner designed purely to manipulate external perception. During that highly monitored interaction, she had probed the motivation behind his selection criteria. She correctly identified that other available subjects possessed superior strategic value. She demanded to know why she was chosen. You and I know that predators do not select prey by accident, and his response confirmed this reality. James had dissected his meal with the unhurried mechanics of an apex predator who weaponizes time to establish dominance. Elevating his gaze, he cited her obsessive analysis of their initial contract. While others merely complied, she had scrutinized the document repeatedly, engaging external legal counsel and generating extensive retaliatory clauses. He paused his physical movements entirely. The silence amplify the psychological weight of his impending admission. He informed her that standard subjects, paralyzed by threats, default to submission. She, however, had processed extreme psychological terror and proceeded with calculated defiance. At the time, lacking the framework to categorize this narcissistic mirroring, she repressed the data point entirely. Now, the defense mechanism was offline, and she analyzed it with clinical precision. The entry perimeter was breached at 40 minutes past midnight. James manifested in the kitchen, halting his advance upon registering her physical state. She remained barefoot, device positioned as a weapon, displaying an adversarial facial configuration. It was a precise muscular tension that multiple observers had historically warned her to suppress, as it telegraphed an imminent and devastating intellectual cross-examination. The clinical reality was absolute. An interrogation was commencing. She commanded him to sit, and the apex predator complied. His focus locked onto hers, and his psychological shielding finally deactivated. She recognized that James had utilized his transit time to formulate a containment strategy. Stick with me, this is where the power dynamic shifts. The lesson here is simple. Truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always surface to dismantle a foundation built on lies. She deployed the name Victor Crane as a verbal strike. He confirmed it. She laid out the timeline of his covert acquisition, predating their union. He offered only affirmative responses. The megalomaniac narcissist leaned inward, deliberately dismantling his physical geometry, projecting vulnerability to survive. Let us examine the pathology of control. James rationalized his manipulation as protection, stating Crane would have used her brother Daniel as a weapon against her. He claimed he used methods he was unwilling to allow others to exploit. Notice the classic megalomaniacal trait, believing only he is qualified to govern her fate. Emma sat there, her breath moving slowly, processing the profound psychological violation. She recognized the symptom. "You made a decision about my life without my consent," she noted, pressing her fingers firmly against the kitchen table. She correctly identified his God complex. He had decided he knew what she needed better than she did. This is the seed of total isolation. She confronted him with the reality of their 7-month marriage, a continuous pattern of unilateral decisions made without her knowledge. "Do you understand why that is unacceptable, even with good intentions?" she asked. James agreed without hesitation, a common tactic of the highly manipulative to feign empathy. "Then help me understand something," she countered, leaning forward. "Who is Victor Crane to you? The real version, not the corporate mask." A car's headlights swept through the kitchen, illuminating the clinical coldness of the scene. James explained that Crane had run the Eastern Territory when James was 23. He needed Crane's infrastructure, then severed the tie. A violent fracture between apex predators. You and I have seen this specific fixation before, in these types of men. The refusal to let go of perceived property. James recounted the schism with a chillingly flat affect, noting Crane lost money, people, and territory. Crane spent 15 years obsessively trying to reclaim what he believed was his. Daniel's debt was merely the psychological trigger. If James had not moved first, Crane would have. Emma sat back, staring at her own steady hands. In a textbook display of trauma adaptation, she began to weigh hypotheticals. She envisioned a timeline where she was negotiated over by Crane rather than claimed by James. She was normalizing her captivity by comparing it to a significantly worse fate. Observe how the subject attempts to reclaim agency through interrogation. Emma deduced that Crane called her because she lacked the complete psychological profile of her husband. Crane hoped the unvarnished truth would frighten her into usefulness. "Is there a version of the full picture that would make me want to cooperate with Victor Crane?" she asked. James exhibited a micro-expression of genuine surprise. "It is rare to catch a master manipulator off guard." "Honestly, I do not know," he admitted, stating it depended on how she weighed the variables. "Tell me," she instructed quietly. "Tell me the data, and let me decide the weight." She was demanding the illusion of a choice she no longer possessed. He did not provide a full confession. Such an overwhelming volume of data would overload her cognitive defenses at nearly 1 a.m. Instead, he mapped the structural pathology of his life. Not a cinematic crime syndicate, but a parasitic network operating in the gray space, where legal commerce masks illicit infrastructure. He described it with the flat, unfeeling honesty characteristic of antisocial personalities who no longer bother to simulate normal morality. He claimed it served the purpose of maintaining a specific that kind of order. In a chaotic world, the ultimate narcissist's justification for absolute control. Then, he listed 3 individuals who became collateral damage to his violent gravitational pull. He cataloged the year he spent attempting to rectify his damages, clinical in his assessment of his own failures and successes. He outlined an 8-year-old decision he would alter, and 2 recent ones he would repeat without hesitation. Notice the behavioral baseline here. He did not apologize. Emma observed this exact detail. He offered a highly structured accounting of his actions, exhibiting a precision that proved he had ruminated on these irreversible outcomes for years. But he withheld the one thing a healthy mind would offer: genuine remorse. He did not apologize, because sociopathic pragmatism does not allow for performative guilt. He simply laid out the unalterable facts of his permanent psychological condition. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The kitchen fell into a profound silence. Emma let the crushing weight of his reality settle over her, subconsciously measuring her capacity to endure his darkness. She brought up the operative who stalked her 3 weeks prior. James confirmed his associate. Marcus had handled it. A conversation, James called it, his voice stripped of emotional variance. The operative was relocated voluntarily. Emma noted his highly specific definition of the word unharmed. He is breathing and intact, James stated, refusing to express regret for the violence employed. Emma almost smiled. Here we see the Stockholm Syndrome taking root, the victim finding dark comfort in the monster's teeth. Crane's motive was a perceived denial of assets. James discussed this extortion with the detached calmness of someone checking the weather. Crane demanded financial holdings he felt owed from their split, asking for a figure James absolutely refused to entertain. The silence following that statement was absolute. Emma stared at her folded hands, engaging the cognitive dissociation required to survive this environment. She relied on the cold, analytical engine she spent 10 years building as an attorney. Instead of experiencing the natural terror of being hunted by cartel figures, she compartmentalized the trauma. She mapped the structural pressure points of her own life, as if reviewing a client's liability case. She predicted Crane's behavioral loop perfectly. He will send someone else to probe her, assuming she is the softest psychological target. He does not know me very well, she asserted. James agreed, his tone vibrating with a low, possessive warmth. He was indulging her display of defiance. I will not be used as a pressure point, she declared, holding his dead-eyed gaze. Not by him, and certainly not by you. She demanded an end to his covert management and insulation. If her life was threatened, she required direct data from him, not through his subordinates or midnight phone calls. James nodded, adopting the posture of a compliant partner. But a warden does not stop managing the prisoner. Just because the prisoner asks nicely, stick with me here, because this is where the cognitive trap snaps shut. I need you to say it, she insisted. James gave his word to stop managing her. To a healthy mind, the promise of a criminal architect means nothing. But Emma had been immersed in his isolated reality for 7 months. She had rewritten her moral baseline to fit his pathology. She believed his absolute certainty because he rarely made promises at all. Trusting a predator's code is a survival mechanism. She stood up, taking her cup to the sink, turning her back to him. In that small domestic motion, she allowed herself to feel the crushing, inescapable gravity of her new existence. She was no longer a bystander. She was an active participant in her own capture. When she turned back, the clinical mask had slipped from his face. She was in a dangerously unguarded state, a primal fixation that had simply been waiting for the manufactured boundaries to burn away. He referenced their arrangement, choosing his words with deliberate caution. There are things the contract did not account for, he murmured. Her autonomic nervous system betrayed her. Her heart accelerated. Like what? She asked. He gestured slightly to the space between them, the midnight hour. The deeply intimate unraveling of their psychological defenses. They were two highly controlled individuals, suddenly operating without a script, completely unsure of how to survive the very real, very dangerous traumatic attachment forming. We should handle Crane first, she offered, retreating into tactical compartmentalization. James agreed, promising to address the unwritten contract later. She retreated to the safety of her isolated wing of the house, staring at the ceiling, analyzing the bizarre parameters of captivity by a man who purchased her family's debts before they ever met. Her rationalization was nearly complete when the final stimulus arrived. Her phone vibrated with a text message from an untagged variable. It read, Your husband is not the most dangerous person in this situation. It urged her to ask about Catherine. The orchestrator of this message understood exactly how to exploit the fragile, newly formed trust of a trauma-bonded victim. We are about to uncover what truly breaks a mind like hers. The simple life lesson here is that survival often requires us to become as cold as the things that hunt us. Catherine, it was a phantom name, entirely absent from her 7-month catalog of his behaviors. She placed the device face down. She did not panic, and she did not sleep. A lesser subject would have confronted the predator immediately, driven by emotional dysregulation. But Emma's pathology was different. She was ruthlessly strategic. At nearly 1 a.m, with a volatile secret burning through her fragile reality and a highly dangerous man sleeping 30 feet away, her response was pure calculation. She would build her interrogation before facing the monster. Let's open the file on Emma. You and I are going to understand a clinical dynamic together. She sat at the kitchen table, anchored by a coffee cup, waiting since 5 a.m. The name Catherine had acted as a cognitive stimulant all night, keeping her hyper-aroused. It was the specific, grinding dissonance of an analytical mind, handed a piece of data that actively rejects the established psychological schema. When James entered at 6:15, his physical reaction was immediate. Total rigid immobility, not a rehearsed defensive posture, but genuine autonomic freeze. You didn't sleep, he observed. Neither did you, she countered. His unbuttoned collar and drawn features confirmed severe sleep deprivation. She executed her first intervention, sliding the device across the table, with the stimulus message exposed. As he processed the text, Emma shifted into the clinical observer role she had honed over a decade of behavioral analysis. She cataloged the involuntary micro-expressions, the minute tightening of the masseter muscle, the erratic ocular movements as his prefrontal cortex calculated containment strategies. She processed this neurological cascade in 4 seconds before he finally sat down. Who sent this? She probed. I don't know yet, but you know the name. Emma stabilized her hands around the ceramic mug. Tell me about Catherine. His silence wasn't evasive. It was the heavy pause of a subject deciding where to begin the unburdening. Emma used the silence therapeutically, understanding the precise ratio of pressure to patience required to extract a disclosure. Catherine Reeves, he finally verbalized. We were involved 6 years ago, before I fully severed ties with Crane's syndicate. Emma maintained total facial neutrality, an essential technique when receiving trauma data. Involved for 2 years, he added, meeting her gaze without the typical avertive behaviors of guilt. She understood my operational reality and actively consented to it. Then she executed a behavioral pivot I failed to predict, resulting in the incarceration of 3 syndicate members due to intelligence she fed to a federal task force. Emma processed the betrayal. She was an informant out of pure survival panic. I comprehend her psychological mechanism, even if the operational cost to me was severe, he confessed. When Emma inquired about her disposition, James detailed the standard relocation protocols. She's been excised from my life for 6 years, he stated. As far as you knew, Emma challenged. She introduced the primary stressor. Does Victor Crane know about Catherine? The mention of his former kingpin triggered a distinct physiological flinch, a textbook manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, the lingering trauma bond to his old captor. Why? Because the digital artifact hadn't originated from Crane's network. The numerical signatures lacked correlation, indicating an unidentified third actor actively manipulating them. The analytical variable is whether this entity aligns with Crane, opposes him, or specifically targets you, Emma deduced. James exhibited a novel facial response, not quite surprise, as his baseline hypervigilance precluded that, but a profound involuntary recognition. It was the look of a captive who desperately needed an intellectual equal. You mapped this entire sociopathic architecture overnight, he noted. I had time, she replied clinically, and I applied my former professional conditioning. A micro-expression mimicking a smile, threatened his features, a non-verbal leakage Emma effortlessly categorized. Returning to the interrogation, he disclosed the operative variable. The federal task force was commanded by an agent named Darren Cole. Cole had transitioned into the private sector 3 years prior. When James hesitated, the unspoken truth saturated the room before he vocalized it. Cole was now an asset for Victor Crane. Stick with me, we must analyze the gravity of this development. Crane, who suffered severe narcissistic injury when James defected, had acquired the federal architect who possessed James's complete operational dossier. Cole retained the files and the specific psychological vulnerabilities. Emma synthesized the threat matrix instantly. Crane isn't just executing a financial extraction, she concluded, her tone completely devoid of panic. He is methodically constructing an inescapable legal mechanism. He intends to manufacture federal extortion power or outsource the destruction. Applying pressure to her temples to aid cognitive focus, Emma articulated the worst-case scenario. If Catherine has re-entered this behavioral loop, she functions as the ultimate credible witness. She is the empirical proof. James softly validated this hypothesis. Catherine was the singular entity possessing sufficient data to operationalize the threat. Therefore, who transmitted the stimulus to me? Emma pressed, probing the boundaries of Crane's inner circle. Who possessed the specific insight to weaponize Catherine as an emotional lever against James? Exhibiting severe cognitive fatigue, James tilted his head backward. Catherine herself, he hypothesized. She is either executing a warning, or she is actively testing the integrity of our psychological bond. He evaluated her with clinical precision. Catherine was incapable of arbitrary action. Her behaviors were always deeply goal-oriented. If she initiated contact, it serves her direct survival mandate. Emma absorbed this seamlessly. Then we analyze her motives and extract what she requires, she proposed, compartmentalizing the messy emotional variables like a seasoned strategist. At her use of the collective pronoun, we, a fleeting emotional disruption crossed his features, though she deliberately ignored it. Do you possess a secure communication channel to her? He exhibited sudden protective resistance, a classic manifestation of his lingering trauma. Emma, you do not need to integrate into this pathology. Her response was a boundary enforced with steel. You provided verbal confirmation of our partnership less than 6 hours ago, she reminded him, dismantling his protective instincts. The logic was impenetrable. The subject contacted Emma directly, permanently binding her to the psychological matrix. We process this shared trauma together, or I execute the analysis independently. Those are the empirical options. The silence stretched for 4 highly calculated seconds before his compliance was secured. Together, he conceded, you and I have probably both witnessed this type of hyperfocus before. For 4 hours, Emma regressed into her core operational state. She mined databases, cross-referencing archival federal records with Crane's current syndicate assets, constructing a flawless timeline of behaviors. When the associate re-established contact, Emma had synthesized a 6-year behavioral profile of Victor Crane that likely exceeded the Kingpin's own conscious memory of his actions. James observed her aggregated data, his silence speaking volumes about his internal recalibration of her threat level. You process this intelligence in 4 hours, he observed. Analytical conditioning does not degrade, she replied. Reaching across her, he isolated a specific corporate entity, a sophisticated shell company, buried beneath layers of Crane's holdings, established 18 months prior. It was the mechanism designed for untraceable capital displacement. He hovered within exactly 6 inches of her physical space, close enough to study his intense focus. Is this data practical? He asked. It is highly applicable, she confirmed. His vocal timbre had undergone a profound shift. It lacked the calculated warmth she had previously catalogued, and it lacked his standard defensive detachment. It was a synthesized third state, a pure, predatory focus. Recognizing the escalating tension, Emma deployed immediate practical instruction to shatter the emotional resonance building in the room. "Initiate contact using the acquired number," she ordered. James rapidly re-regulated his nervous system and executed the call. Catherine answered on the second ring. Her vocal presentation was flat, devoid of affect, carrying the specific, hyper-vigilant steadiness of a subject surviving a prolonged state of existential threat. "I hypothesized how long this would take," she stated. "What was the strategic utility of contacting my spouse?" James interrogated, stripping all emotion from his delivery. "Because she required the data to survive," Catherine countered. "Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we?" Catherine had monitored Crane, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, constructing his mechanism of revenge. Cole possessed the dossier necessary to guarantee James's incarceration. Crane's methodology was textbook sociopathy. Weaponize the data for psychological extortion, or deploy federal instruments for total annihilation. "I found that outcome unacceptable," Catherine stated. Emma interjected, analyzing the deeper motive. "Because whatever his pathology, James is not the monster that Victor Crane is," Catherine explained with clinical detachment. "Furthermore, I harbor a psychological debt to him," Catherine confessed. Emma bypassed the emotional subtext and executed a direct behavioral probe. "What is your primary objective?" The response carried the immense neurological weight of prolonged trauma. "I require permanent extraction." She diagnosed her own existence as a failure. 6 years in federal preservation, trapped in an illusion of safety. Here is the clinical truth about survival. Simply staying alive is never enough if you surrender your autonomy to do it. I demand restoration of my autonomy. I want Victor Crane neutralized so my empirical value as a witness drops to 0. I refuse to remain an asset. She paused. "With my intelligence and your operational capacity, we can execute this." James froze. "Let us open this file together, you and I, and examine the precise anatomy of an ultimatum." Catherine's voice over the line did not waver when she demanded trust from the very man whose people she had sent to federal prison. She offered Victor Crane on a silver platter, but the price was total compliance. The silence that followed from James was profound, a deliberate cognitive pause. He asked for 12 hours. She gave him 8. Tomorrow morning, the trap would close, and options would simply become consequences. James placed his phone flat on the table, staring at his hands. "Here is a simple truth about human survival. Trust is never a moral virtue in these dark environments. It is strictly a calculated currency, spent only when absolutely necessary." Emma sat quietly, observing his behavioral baseline shift. She watched the internal calculation happening behind his eyes, that distinct neural processing when environmental variables suddenly exceed normal parameters. She recognized this micro-expression. It meant he was arriving at a decision his subconscious had already made. He acknowledged the 8-hour timeline, knowing Catherine was the only viable point of control to neutralize the threat of Victor Crane. Emma met his gaze steadily, asking what he needed from her. He looked up. He needed her to understand that the incoming data could never be unknown. The lesson here is timeless. True always carries the heavy, irreversible price of our own innocence. She reminded him that she had already agreed to this exposure. He countered that she had signed up for information, not active participation. Emma leaned forward, her body language rejecting her former trauma responses. For 2 years, she had lived at the absolute edge of her own existence, paralyzed by the fear of repeated emotional injury, using legal documents as a psychological perimeter fence. Maintaining direct eye contact, she declared she was done hiding. She was stepping into the center of the blast radius with him. James Hawke was not a dramatic man, but the quiet collapse of his internal load-bearing walls was entirely visible. We cannot heal while hiding behind defensive barricades. Eventually, we must step back into the line of fire to truly live. He accepted her pivot with clinical efficiency, and they shifted into operational mode. Working deep into the evening, they were joined by Marcus and 2 unidentified operatives. These men moved with the quiet competence of individuals whose skill sets do not exist on standard resumes. James directed the tactical flow, while Emma functioned as the analytical engine, processing Catherine's raw intelligence. Emma identified 3 specific financial instruments. If properly weaponized, these documents would create a self-contained legal snare for Crane, eliminating the need for Catherine to testify. True, lasting power rarely screams for attention. It simply works quietly in the background, making deliberate adjustments until the trap is perfectly and inescapably set. Emma verbalized the psychological beauty of the strategy. By rendering Catherine entirely irrelevant as a witness, they stripped the megalomaniac narcissist of his primary target. Crane would have no reason to hunt Catherine, Hunter, or James, because the trap was built entirely from public records hiding in plain sight. They merely needed the right authority to look at the documents in the correct sequence. James studied her legal architecture, noting she had essentially built a federal prosecution. Emma thought of 2 former colleagues, a prosecutor she deeply respected, and a judge who trusted her judgment. Yes, she knew someone. Sometimes the most devastating way to defeat a monster is to systematically render them entirely irrelevant to the equation. James noted a critical variable. When this operation succeeded, Victor Crane would realize James possessed an intellectual asset he failed to account for. Emma did not flinch, simply stating it was good for him to know. James stared at her, and then a profound behavioral anomaly occurred. For the first time in 7 months, he laughed. It was an unguarded, spontaneous, effective response originating deep in his chest, escaping without intellectual permission. Emma felt the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, a sudden clearing of the psychological weather. He admitted she terrified him slightly, a reality she accepted with absolute sincerity. There is a profound, terrifying beauty in showing our true strength to someone who finally understands exactly what we are capable of. James executed the external manipulations with the cold precision of a man used to high-pressure environments. Emma matched him, constructing an inescapable legal architecture. At 9:47 that evening, the lethal package of financial records and a recorded conversation landed on the federal prosecutor's desk. By 10:30, a judge signed 3 warrants. By 11:15, Victor Crane was in custody. Marcus delivered the news from the doorway. His vocal tone remained perfectly flat, but Emma recognized the microscopic relaxation of his facial muscles, a release of structural tension held for years. We often carry the crushing weight of our survival for so long that we entirely forget what it feels like to finally put the burden down. James sat across from her, processing the new reality in complete silence. Marcus provided the post-incident data. Cole was already cooperating, rapidly creating distance from Crane's collapsing empire, and Catherine was secure. As Marcus withdrew, Emma sat perfectly still, allowing the massive flood of cortisol and adrenaline that had fueled her for 14 hours to finally recede. The physical crash was absolute. She was experiencing a profound cellular exhaustion that only follows hyper-focused survival states. Yet, beneath the fatigue, she was fully tethered to her own existence for the first time in 2 years. The deepest peace a human mind will ever experience usually waits for us right on the other side of our most grueling and terrifying psychological battles. James watched her carefully. She prompted him to speak, and this rigidly controlled man admitted he simply did not know what to say. It was a staggering moment of vulnerability. He sat leaning forward, displaying that same unguarded effect she had catalogued earlier in the day. The mask was gone. The patient, authentic version of him was finally surfacing from beneath layers of defensive posturing. Emma spoke quietly about their behavioral contract, noting its terms did not cover this current emotional reality. She moved to the window, gazing out at the city where she had spent 2 years obsessively managing her emotional risk. Safety is a beautiful illusion, but you can never write a rigid legal contract to protect a human heart from the absolute necessity of feeling. Stick with me here. because this is where the psychological pivot happens. Emma looked away from the glass and stated her desire to renegotiate everything. She demanded the complete termination of their artificial arrangements, no more silences of air, no more scheduled dinners, no more avoiding the emotional undercurrents. She looked directly into the eyes of a deeply dangerous man and demanded the real thing, outside the safety of documentation. He crossed the room, stopping exactly 2 feet away, breaching the carefully constructed quarter of distance they had maintained. A life lived strictly within the safe margins of paper is merely a rehearsal. To experience the real thing, you have to be willing to burn the entire script and step into the fire. He quickly noted this was a massive departure from their original operating parameters. She countered that she was an exceptional lawyer who negotiated hard. Then, he reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. It was a physical expression of affection so deliberate it bypassed all her cognitive defenses and lodged permanently in her chest. He whispered her maiden name, but she immediately corrected him to Hawk, claiming her new identity. He laughed, a warm, resonant sound. In that dimly lit study, Emma realized the most vital human connections cannot be mandated by signatures and triplicate. The most beautiful things in our existence can never be forced by pure logic. They can only be surrendered to in a moment of absolute, terrifying vulnerability. True emotional integration can only be chosen in real time, in the messy reality of the life you are actually occupying, by a mind deciding the risk of authenticity outweighs the safety of isolation. She had finally made that choice, abandoning her fear of the unknown. The following morning, after Victor Crane had been caged, Emma's phone displayed 3 missed calls from Ryan Calloway. She stared at the screen, clinically analyzing the staggering audacity of a man suffering from such profound narcissistic blindness that he could not read a room. Even when the rejection was explicit, true emotional closure happens the exact moment we stop fearing the ghosts of our past and simply look at their desperate attempts for attention. With quiet, absolute indifference, she decided to audit the voicemails. The first was an attempt at casual normalization, which she deleted. The second escalated, probing for information about her husband with feigned concern. She deleted that one too. By the third message, Ryan's narcissistic delusion was fully exposed. His voice carried the entitled cadence of a man who spent the night convincing himself his closed doors were still open. He tried to reassert superiority, referencing previous comments about her deserving better. She recognized the behavioral loop for what it was, a desperate grasp for control. We owe absolutely nothing to the manipulators of our past, especially when they only come knocking to see if their old psychological chains still hold us. We begin with a classic severing of former attachments. A man named Ryan sends a message offering a lifeline. Emma immediately deletes and blocks the number. In behavioral terms, she is shedding her civilian identity. It tells us that sometimes survival means cutting away the people who knew you before the trauma. She descends the stairs to find James intruding on her established territory. For 7 months, the morning kitchen was her isolated domain, a highly controlled environment. Now he stands there with 2 cups of coffee. He is quietly restructuring the grammar of their domestic space, a clear assertion of shared dominance. She accepts the breach and mentions Ryan's call. James turns, raises one eyebrow, and calmly acknowledges it. Emma diagnoses Ryan's motive with absolute detachment. She notes he has seen the news about Crane and views her complicated life as an opening. By offering himself as a rescuer, he reveals his own need for control. She takes the coffee James offers. Accepting his physical gesture of a truce, she explicitly confirms she blocked the number, establishing a new behavioral baseline of total transparency. Microscopic expression flickers across James's face, a restrained, entirely genuine amusement that only a trained observer would catch. He praises her honesty. Emma then pivots immediately to tactical reality, asking about the day's events. James details that the federal prosecutor begins formal proceedings against Crane, with Cole scheduled for deposition. Let us examine this interaction closely, you and I. James explains that 3 warrants will bloom into a broader indictment within 30 days. He leans against the counter, holding eye contact, and casually mentions his own legal exposure. Emma is entirely unsurprised. Her hypervigilance kept her awake, predicting this exact variable. She asks for a threat assessment, and he labels it manageable with the right counsel. The silence stretches between them, a fascinating psychological pivot where defensive barriers dissolve into pure candor. She reminds him of her history as a corporate litigator specializing in financial crime. This is the moment a symbiotic alliance forms. It shows us that shared danger is often the quickest path to genuine intimacy. She asserts her current role as his wife, weaponizing her proximity to his life. James attempts to define the boundaries of spousal privilege, but Emma sharply interrupts. Her vocal tone remains entirely flat, a textbook display of emotional regulation under extreme pressure. She is not offering formal representation. She is demanding insertion into his inner circle as a master strategist. She states firmly that she is done standing on the periphery. James places his cup on the counter with methodical precision. He strips away his usual guarded persona, exposing a rare, unmanaged psychological state. He gives her his absolute, undivided attention. It is a profound shift, acknowledging her transition from a passive observer to an active, dangerous participant. His compliance is immediate. He plainly states that it is good. Emma commands him to summon his attorney, insisting on her presence. The 90-minute evaluation confirms her nocturnal threat assessment. James faces narrow vulnerabilities tied to 2 ambiguous financial instruments. The psychological cure for this exposure lies in the documentation Emma constructed hours prior. Enter Gillian Park, a fiercely pragmatic attorney, acting as his legal shield. Gillian absorbs Emma's tactical breakdown without interruption, a clear marker of professional respect among apex predators. Upon hearing Emma's pedigree at a top firm, Gillian pauses and validates the defensive framework entirely. Competence, you see, is the only currency that matters to the deeply paranoid. Gillian probes deeper, searching for Emma's intellectual origins. Emma cites her own self-reliance, followed by the mentorship of a prominent judge. A subtle tonal shift reveals Gillian's reverence for this figure. Emma casually acknowledges the judge's inflated ego, prompting a suppressed vocalization of amusement from James. Gillian commits to filing preliminary motions and offers a rare expression of gratitude before disconnecting. In the ensuing quiet, James notes that his attorney does not typically dispense thanks. Emma lowers her pen, a physical gesture of finalized authority, and coldly states he should have utilized her skills months ago. He cites her original demand for ignorance. Her reply is clinical and ego-free. She admits she was entirely wrong. James absorbs this unfiltered admission. Highly effective operators rarely qualify their mistakes. They simply recalibrate. He murmurs that he will note the revision. The interaction assumes a deceptive normalcy. That is the true danger of high-stress bonding. It eventually disguises itself as mundane domesticity. They share coffee and dissect legal strategies, having abandoned the charade of isolation. It feels correct, pathological adaptation, masking itself as simple comfort. The human mind will normalize any environment to survive, making peace with the chaos. Later, while Emma processes data in the study, Marcus materializes at the threshold. His nonverbal cues are so alarming that she drops her pen instantly, her threat detection systems flaring to life. Marcus delivers the external stimulus. Catherine Reeves has been located. Emma stands, her physiological response spiking. She questions the failure of the protective handlers, assuming an immediate physical threat. Marcus carefully de-escalates the tension, stating Catherine is not in danger. She is simply having approached the door 20 minutes prior with a specific demand to speak with Emma. Emma processes this anomaly. Why her? She runs a rapid mental inventory. James is isolated on a call nearby. She stands at the epicenter of a 6-year psychological war, contemplating the woman who previously occupied James's affections. A woman who hoarded a recorded conversation, like a desperate survival token. For 6 long years in federal exile, Emma seizes control of the variable immediately. She instructs Marcus to withhold the information from James, demanding a 10-minute window of isolation. Marcus displays a microscopic fracture in his professional facade, a restrained flicker of concern. Upon entering the room, Emma observes Catherine Reeves. The woman is physically diminished, presenting the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture of a long-term captive. Her eyes are permanently locked in threat assessment mode. She sits with hands tightly folded, lacking any predatory aggression or manipulative charm. There is no psychological game being played here. She is merely an exhausted survivor awaiting a verdict. It is a stark reminder of what prolonged fear does to a human body. If you and I review this interrogation, we see Emma bypass social pleasantries, establishing immediate authority. Catherine admits she evaded her handler, granting them 40 minutes. Emma coldly demands her motive. Catherine's answer is profound. Emma is the anomaly, the variable that disrupted the behavioral model. Catherine confesses that when she initially made contact, she misdiagnosed Emma as a fragile civilian, a mere pawn requiring a warning. She assumed James was isolating Emma for protection. But the reality is far more lethal. Catherine recounts how Emma dismantled Crane in mere hours, weaponizing records that trained investigators ignored. It proves that underestimating an opponent based on assumptions is a fatal cognitive bias. Catherine's delivery remains flat, devoid of emotional inflection. She concludes that Emma is no civilian, a diagnosis Emma accepts without hesitation. Catherine engages in a self-soothing gesture, unfolding and refolding her hands, a motor tic common in those unaccustomed to vulnerability. She confesses her true compulsion, a desperate need to observe the apex partner, James selected after the trauma of the past 6 years. She delivers her assessment with steady eyes, stating that he chose perfectly. The silence that follows is heavy. Emma studies this shattered woman, who previously bonded with James, who succumbed to a perfectly rational fear, and who clung to a digital recording as a desperate talisman against a hostile, unforgiving reality. In a rare emotional shift, Emma experiences a surge of pure, unpolluted empathy. She realizes this woman is merely collateral damage in a much larger psychological war. Emma offers her clinical absolution. Catherine is no longer a tactical asset or a liability. She is entirely free. Catherine's jaw tightens, a physiological struggle to process a pardon she believed was impossible. Suddenly, the environment shifts. James appears at the threshold. His visual tracking is instantaneous. Emma, Catherine, Emma again. In 3 seconds, the massive neurological weight of 6 years registers on his face. It is not trauma or rage, but the final, silent burial of a dead timeline. Emma simply speaks his name, anchoring him back to the present moment. Emma firmly states they were finishing, maintaining her control over the stimulus. A massive nonverbal data exchange occurs between them. In one sustained look, she communicates her unilateral decision to manage the threat, and he processes the immense level of trust this requires. A true psychological partnership demands absolute behavioral alignment, and he accepts the boundary by leaning against the frame in silence. Catherine rises. She observes James with the heavy gaze of a survivor who has cauterized a severe emotional wound, but still carries the permanent scar tissue. She offers an apology, fully aware it cannot balance the emotional ledger. James remains perfectly silent. Some wounds simply do not require our forgiveness to heal. Let us examine Catherine's departure through a clinical lens. The subjects did not engage in forgiveness. Forgiveness is a layman's term for emotional surrender. Instead, we see a fascinating example of cognitive closure. They acknowledge each other as survivors of a shared psychological trauma. Catherine nods, stating, "James is not easy." Emma agrees, mirroring the sentiment, asserting Catherine is equally difficult. We see a micro-expression on Catherine's face, a transient muscular relaxation that mimics a smile. She takes her belongings and departs, escorted by Marcus. The environment returns to a baseline state of silence. You and I must understand this. Survival rarely ends with a cinematic embrace. It ends with the quiet closing of a door and the sudden absence of a threat. Observe the behavioral pivot in our primary subject, James. He states he handled the situation, utilizing the exact phrasing from months prior, yet his vocal acoustics have entirely shifted. This is no longer the flat effect of a pragmatist managing an asset. The tone betrays the psychological shock of a man realizing he possesses something invaluable. He asks her to approach. She moves, and he meets her at the exact midpoint of the room. Clinically speaking, this spatial negotiation is the ultimate metric of their new power dynamic. He places his hand on her face with deliberate tactile grounding. The lesson here is simple. Even the most rigid defenses will eventually collapse when confronted with undeniably authentic human connection. The subject now engages in voluntary disclosure, a rare action for a highly defended personality. He details his initial rationale for purchasing her debt 2 years prior. He claims it was an exercise in protection management, a cognitive distortion, a cognitive management designed to mask his fixation. He carefully admits he recognized his compromised state before she even entered the negotiation space. Emma maintains absolute physical stillness, conserving her physiological resources. He recalls her 14-page contractual addendum, vetted by 2 attorneys. She approached him across that table, not as a submissive victim, but as an adversary ready to litigate her own survival. In captivity narratives, the most effective defense mechanism is often a meticulously organized mind. Let us look closer at his admission. He notes she was entirely prepared to lose the negotiation, yet determined to extract a heavy psychological toll from her captor. He maintains direct ocular contact, confessing this was never a mere transaction. His vocal modulation drops, signaling absolute conviction that this bond would be his first genuine reality in 20 years. Emma regulates her respiration, consciously choosing to process this massive emotional data rather than employ avoidance tactics. James attempts to articulate his pathology, explaining how he engineered emotional distance to prevent attachments from being weaponized against him. It was a classic survival adaptation, yet he concedes that keeping her at a clinical distance became a structural impossibility. What is fascinating here is Emma's methodology. She did not dismantle his barriers through aggressive confrontation. She simply existed in a state of unyielding authenticity, rendering his meticulously maintained distance entirely obsolete. She actively suppresses a crying response, engaging her prefrontal cortex to override the emotional surge. She categorizes weeping as a biological reaction, reserved strictly for trauma, choosing to absorb positive stimuli without physical leakage. She verbally establishes the termination of their previous behavioral contract. James confirms the renegotiation. She dictates the new parameters: authentic partnership, the elimination of spatial barriers, and the cessation of cognitive avoidance. She is seizing joint control over the entire environment. She proceeds to establish rigid, non-negotiable boundaries. She demands immediate verbal disclosure regarding any environmental threats. Furthermore, she issues a highly specific ultimatum: if he ever subjects her to covert surveillance again, she will construct a legal framework so impenetrable that top-tier defense attorneys will fail to dismantle it. James observes her threat and then produces a genuine, unmanaged vocalization of amusement. As analysts, we rarely get to witness the exact moment a hardened defense mechanism shatters into pure joy. The auditory input hits her nervous system like a thermal shift after a prolonged freeze. For the first time in 7 months of documented hypervigilance, the subject willingly physically leans into his touch. The subsequent weeks present a complex integration phase. Navigating a reality built on the boundary of legal and illicit operations is inherently unstable. Federal proceedings demand extensive cognitive labor and communication with legal counsel. We observe James handling external systemic threats from displaced associates using baseline emotional regulation, informing Emma only post-resolution, strictly adhering to their newly negotiated parameters. The secondary antagonist, Ryan, has fled the territory. Emma cognitively files this data under obsolete stressors. Later, Daniel arrives at their residence for a shared meal, exhibiting the high autonomic arousal of a man attempting to occupy a space that previously served as a psychological danger zone. James initiates the interaction by noting Daniel's delayed arrival. The men are not exhibiting warmth. Rather, they are engaging in a calculated territorial tolerance as devoid of the oppressive, unspoken hostility that previously defined their dynamic. Emma observes them, debating sports statistics, a classic male bonding ritual used to safely channel competitive aggression. She processes this mundane interaction as a statistical anomaly, an impossible stabilization of her environment. The following month, a tactile artifact arrives, a postcard from Catherine, originating from an untraceable location. It contains a brief, four-word expression of gratitude. It serves as proof of successful reintegration into society, which Emma promptly catalogs on her windowsill. Let us jump forward 4 months. Emma engages in a routine somatic check, visually examining her own hands. This is a grounding technique, confirming her physical autonomy after prolonged periods of external control. She detects James entering the perimeter. In the past, his proximity triggered an immediate spike in her cortisol levels, forcing her to map his location with defensive precision. Now, his gravitational pull is simply a baseline environmental factor. He positions himself directly beside her. The spatial barrier is gone. This is how subjects interact when hypervigilance is deactivated. You and I can see the profound truth here. True safety is not the absence of danger, but the quiet presence of someone you no longer have to carefully monitor. They engage in a seamless, non-verbal exchange of resources, transferring a beverage without the performative hesitations that characterizes managed relationships. He delivers an external status update. The legal apparatus has officially processed the remaining charges against their adversary. The threat will be neutralized by the spring quarter. They share a brief, sideways ocular assessment. The environmental lighting is unremarkable, yet deeply significant. What was once a contested zone, her territory versus his, has completely synthesized into a shared habitat. The surrounding urban infrastructure continues its mechanical hum. They have effectively constructed a secure psychological fortress, right in the middle of a chaotic world, requiring no further defensive maneuvers. At this exact juncture, Emma occupies the precise center of her own locus of control. James queries her internal state. Her mind initiates a rapid retrospective sequence. The hostile social environment 8 months prior, the microscopic defensive measures she employed, the meticulously drafted contractual armor, and the isolated woman who eventually fled to an undisclosed location. She analyzes the data and reaches a definitive psychological conclusion. She recognizes that maintaining a clinically secure, heavily defended perimeter offers safety, but it fundamentally starves the human organism. The calculated risk of genuine attachment yields a far higher evolutionary reward than chronic isolation. She informs him she wishes to attend the upcoming gallery event. When he asks for her underlying motivation, her response is devoid of manipulation. She simply states her desire to enter the social arena. With her partner entirely stripped of performative utility, James processes this data, his facial micro-expressions, softening into absolute authenticity, a variable she will spend the remainder of her life studying. He agrees. We observe them later, re-entering the original site of her social trauma. She wears a visually striking burgundy garment, projecting confidence rather than camouflage. His hand rests on her lumbar spine. This is not the calculated, optical illusion of intimacy dictated by their previous arrangement. This is a verified, tactile declaration of mutual ownership. They are presenting a united psychological front. She navigates the complex psychiatric with her previous psychological armor. She is no longer the hypervigilant subject attempting to regulate her exposure near the perimeter walls. The surrounding social sites are actively attempting to map her on their invisible iris of power, it is utterly irrelevant. Emma has achieved complete ego integration. She has consciously selected her reality, refusing to justify her parameters to external observers. The fragile, pitied specimen they once analyzed has transformed into an apex presence. We must conclude our evaluation with this simple reality. Genuine power is not about eliminating the complications of your existence, but claiming absolute, unapologetic ownership over every chaotic, difficult piece of it.
One of the most powerful lessons from Emma Miller's story is that true self-worth does not depend on how others see us, especially those who once hurt us. Ryan Calloway tries to humiliate Emma in public by suggesting that she is still alone, still diminished, and still waiting for a man to complete her life. His words are not casual. They are designed to reopen old wounds. He assumes that because he betrayed her and moved on, she must have remained emotionally frozen in the past. But Emma's calm response shows how much she has grown. She does not scream, beg, or try to prove her value through anger. She simply stands still, smiles, and reveals that she is no longer the woman Ryan imagined. This is an important educational lesson. People who once underestimated us often continue to see an outdated version of us. They may remember us at our weakest and assume that weakness became our identity. Emma teaches that healing sometimes means allowing people to be wrong about you without rushing to correct them. Her dignity is powerful because it is quiet. She knows who she is before James Hawke enters the room. James' arrival might or may shock Ryan, but Emma had already won the emotional battle by refusing to let Ryan define her. This lesson is especially valuable for anyone recovering from betrayal, rejection, or public humiliation. Her self-worth should not be built on revenge, marriage status, wealth, or social recognition. It should come from the inner knowledge that someone else's cruelty does not decide your value. Emma's strength lies in the fact heir no longer needs Ryan's regret to feel whole.